Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. It has been a minute since I've done any kind of video work, and it's been even longer since we talked about these things. Axle housings, that is the topic of today's video, and hopefully I can get some good content and bring you guys up to speed at where I'm at with these. So just because I have not videoed anything doesn't mean I haven't been doing work. If you go back a couple of months ago, I did a pretty good in-depth video on, components of the axles that will go onto the truck, and a little bit of, fabrication work that I've already started on the housings. Well, if you look at that video, you can see that this housing here looks considerably different than it did when I ended off that video. So more recently, in the past couple of weeks, I have been kind of beefing these housings up and making them stronger, hoping that they'll live up to a life in a monster truck. And not only am I beefing the housings up, it also kind of makes it easier for me to add on and make them fit in the truck. For example, at the end of the previous video on axles, this housing here was really round on the top. As you can see, where I've added this truss to add strength to the housing, I've also added a nice flat area where I can attach upper link mounts. Same with the shock mounting location. I have a nice flat pad so that I can build off of this flat area for shock mounting. But all in all, there's quite a bit more to it than just that. And what I'm gonna do is get behind the camera and kind of go over what I've done to these housings as of late. I did not do any time lapse or any videoing. Unlike the wheels, I time-lapsed a lot of stuff as I jumped right into that project. These ones here, I just wanted to get going and kind of just skipped over the videoing part. So now I'm just gonna try and bring it up to speed and go over what is done, and then we will continue on from there. In the original axle housing video, when I left off, this was basically just a semi-truck housing that I cut the spindles off of, welded these flanges on with tubes that are inserted inside of that housing. They've got bulkhead plates in there helping support that inner axle tube. And at the end of that video, this axle right here actually had a third member bolted in place and a champagne and knuckle on each end. Then a little later on, at the end of a video more recently, I kind of went over how I took some measurements so I could create the profile of that housing in PlasmaCam. I took those measurements and drew up the pattern so that I could cut these plates out and build this truss to reinforce this housing. Now, as you can see, I've also basically plated in the end of these flanges. It's 1/2-inch plate right here, which also creates 1/2 of the lower link mount. And by plating this, basically covering the end of this flange, it keeps me from running into an issue with the bolt holes, which were visible on this side. So this piece here not only ties the housing, it's welded to the original housing down underneath this boxed area. As a matter of fact, I can show you on this side. You can see this plate is welded to the housing, and it is fully welded around this flange. Then the next step was to build this truss. So this truss piece started out as a flat plate here. It has a big slot right here. So it's basically like a 2.5-inch long plug weld right here. It's welded directly to the housing. It come out, and then this plate right here actually goes clear down in here and welds to the original axle housing right about this location here. Once that was all tacked in place, these plates were cut out that fit the profile of the original axle housing, and they fit this angle right here. Once everything was cut, cleaned up, and tacked in place, I went through and completely welded this out. Welded, any of the plug welds, anything to tie plates together. This here was all welded. This was welded, this plate right here, this top plate, welds on the inside of these end plates, all the way down. This top plate is also welded to this housing. Everything that I could reach is welded together. And then these open ends right here were welded over the top after that internal welding was all done. This was capped off here. And as I mentioned before, this is where I'll build off of for shock mounting location. While I was doing that, obviously both housings were done. This one being a front axle housing. I had mentioned in the original video, this housing here has a bit of caster built into it. So I went ahead and squared all of this stuff up with the housing and then kind of compensated for the difference with these flanges welded on 12 degrees rotated back. That's why you see this angle here on this plate. That's where I'm going from straight into this transition of how everything's rotated. I'll show you on the other housing how everything is just straight on that housing because there is no caster built into the housing or the flanges. While I was beefing up the housings, I tried to integrate a few pieces in while I was at it, like these lower link mounts. As I said, this here is basically one piece with the lower half of where I capped this flange. So this piece comes up and it was split in half so that I could put this lower section up around the original tube and then this upper section comes down from the top. This is the inner half of the lower link mount. It welds from the top of the axle tube, the factory axle tube, down and around the bottom. See if I can get a little bit of a view of that. As you can see, it spans that distance there. And then I went ahead and boxed this entire area in, and that's just tying these two together and also adding a bit of strength to that axle tube itself. This is, of the stock axle housing, this is probably, I would say, the weaker point, just because it just gets a little bit narrower and thinner. So this is basically just a big gusset. It's just boxed in and just creating more girth here at the end of the axle tube. Now we'll go over here and take a look at the rear housing, which it looks quite a bit different than it did the last time you saw it. Everything as far as the truss is done basically the same way as the front. Everything fits here the same. Ended up with a flat area to work with for my upper link mounts. This plate here extends all the way down to the outside of the axle tube, the original axle tube down here. It's all welded internally. Everything's boxed in, capped in. As I mentioned before, this is straight and flat because there's no transition or, there's no caster. There's no angle change in this flange for the champagne mounts. This is slightly different, as you can see in the middle of this span right here, or the middle of the truss. This flat plate, I've got this lift and link bolted here, but this flat plate is basically where the bump stop on the chassis strikes. So as the suspension compresses, theoretically, the bump stop should strike this pad. Now the reason it's drilled and tapped is if it doesn't work out that way, if say I missed a measurement or throughout the suspension cycle, something changes and I'm not hitting this plate quite like I want, I can bolt something else on in place of this. I could build a slightly bigger pad or a slightly longer pad, something, there's just some adjustment there. So outside of that, the front and the rear housings are basically the same. As you can see here on the rear housing, I've got a lot of the steering figured out, set up, tacked up. And I probably have more time invested in getting this steering stuff sorted out than I do just about anything else on the whole axle. This steering is probably quite a bit different than you're gonna see on just about any other monster truck, but there's a reason for that, and I will go over that in this video. But before we get to that, we'll just take a look at some of the other stuff that I have on this housing. So as you can see, I've got a couple of bolts holding a spindle on with the hub, and just about enough guts in here to keep the hub retained. I've got a couple of the planet gears here, inner axle shaft. And the reason I have all that stuff set up on here is because I have the inner axles plugged in so I could double check my measurement. You can see there's a pretty decent gap between those two shafts. And the reason for that is in the carrier of the rear diff, you have a cross for the spider gears. And those axle shafts cannot pass through that cross. So these are not touching, and they're not even close to, create room for that cross in there. Now the rear differential is going to end up with a spool. And because the spool is actually splined all the way through, I have a bit more gap than I need, but it's not going to hurt anything. Luckily, there's actually threaded holes in the end of each shaft. So I think what I'm going to do is build a bolt-on aluminum button that will take up this gap so that when the shafts are splined into the spool, they will have, maybe about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch of area they can float if need be, but they won't be able to slide and move that whole distance. Now the front axle, on the other hand, it will need that amount of room to fit into the side gears in the carrier. Now this is just keeping with the theme of being able to use the same spare parts front and rear. So if I broke a rear shaft, I could take a spare, bolt the button on, plug it in, off we go. If I break a front shaft, I grab a spare shaft, slide it in, good to go. I don't need a front spare or a rear spare. Now a lot of these steering parts that you can see here, all of this is all homemade stuff. It's all cut on the plasma table. These are actually, this is a threaded insert here. So I didn't want to have to run a 10-inch long bolt. So this bolt is actually like 5 inches long, 5.5 inches long, and threads into this big spacer here. Same with this bolt. That's just a mock-up tie rod there, and it will have double tie rods. You can see the tie rod ends right there. It will have 2 tie rods spanning that distance. And since all of this stuff should be the same between the front and the rear axle. So while I was cutting all these parts out, everything is over here to do the same for the front axle. Same with the threaded components, like this spacer right here. I just pointed out on the rear axle. Build a couple of those. These are some threaded inserts. I'll cover that more when we talk about the steering and spacers that I used. So everything that I knew I was going to need for the front axle, I built it at the same time as building the parts for the rear axle. Now we also whipped up a spindle nut socket for this thing too. Now to that steering geometry that I kind of mentioned earlier. I'm going to do my best to try and explain, the theory behind what I was following. But really, if you want to know more about it, just go on Google and look up steering Ackerman angle. You could probably read for an hour and have more knowledge on it than I would be able to give you. Now, I can do the cardboard and crayons version and at least get you in the ballpark to understand what I was shooting for here. So, steering Ackerman angle. In short, all we're looking for is when you're turning your front tires, see if I can get you guys to see the angle better. When you're turning your front tires, you would like that inside tire to turn slightly sharper than the outside tire. So when you're turning in that radius, your front tire is tracking at a sharper radius than the outside tire. Now, if you have what is considered reverse Ackerman, I've driven a rig with reverse Ackerman. As the tires turn, your outside tire turns sharper and you end up scrubbing that outside tire or like skidding the inside tire. Now, reverse Ackerman would probably be like a worst case scenario, but it's very easy to do. Most monster trucks would be set up with a 0 Ackerman. So they're going to have your tie rod mounting points in line with your kingpin. By putting your tie rod mounting points and your kingpin in line with each other, you're going to get a 0 Ackerman. And that's, for the most part, is going to work, especially with four-wheel steer. Now, with 0 Ackerman, you're still going to end up scrubbing that outside tire just because the inside tire is not turning a tiny bit sharper than the outside tire. Now, they're going to tell you by the book, perfect Ackerman for a front steer only vehicle. This point of your tie rod the center line of your tie rod and the center line of your kingpin, if you were to draw a line from both tie rods through both kingpins, they're going to intersect at the center of the rear axle. Does that make sense? It makes sense to me. I don't know how critical that would be. I mean, that's the goal you're shooting for. If you were going to build all of your parts and strive for perfection, that's what you're going to shoot for. Now, I'm pretty sure that Ford Motor Company does not build a different front knuckle for a regular cab long bed F250 versus a four-door long bed F250. They're going to put the same Dana 60 knuckles on the same Dana 60 front axle that would go in either one of those trucks. So there's a little bit of difference in those two applications. So how critical is it really? In my application here, I am certainly not striving for perfection. The fact that most monster trucks have 0 Ackerman, and there are actually quite a lot of trucks, particular Pettibone trucks, that actually have reverse Ackerman. So most Pettibone trucks are going to build 2 plates, and they're going to use that parting line, which is the center of the kingpin. They're going to have these 2 plates bolted together. And the reason for that is so that they can have this big old plate that they can mount tabs off of and mount all of their steering off of those tabs, most of the time in line with these factory mounting locations for the steering cylinder. That ends up with your tie rod being centered inside of your kingpin. Now you're thinking, why would Pettibone do that? You know, they use this stuff on equipment. Ackerman is fairly, that's fairly important on equipment. Well, the thing is, on a Pettibone, this knuckle would be on the housing or on the champagne, the opposite direction. So this mounting location would be on the pinion side of the housing. And if you stop and think about a center line through your kingpin, through that tie rod mounting location on the backside is still going to intersect back there towards the center of the rear housing. So these being on here backwards, and you use this to mount all of your tie rods and everything here inside of that kingpin center line, you're going to end up with reverse Ackerman. And that is why you get something like this conglomeration, instead of something just in line, use what you got, a couple of tabs, easy peasy. That's why this thing looks the way it does. Just trying to get maybe just a little bit of an advantage just in the design side. I'm far from a seasoned or a great driver of any kind. So if I can build some kind of an advantage into my parts, that's going to make me look better than I really am. So I'll take that any day of the week. So now let me get my mug behind the camera again, and let's talk about some of the parts that are in here, or more of the parts that are in here. I already covered these threaded spacers and their function. Showed you this one that was sitting on the table. I also showed these shouldered nuts that I built. And the reason for these is this stock steering mounting location. Pettibone uses an 1.25 inch pin. So obviously these ears here have an 1.25 inch bore going through the center of them. Well, this swivel eye setup that is on my steering cylinder is for a 1-inch pin or a 1-inch bolt. So I had to reduce things down to that diameter there. So basically I need to use a 1-inch bolt to pass through this. So that is what this thread is here. 1-inch bolt thread, and then that is an 1.25 inch outside diameter on this, this minor diameter of the nut. And the reason for that is it fits in that bore. This is another Pettibone knuckle here. And it doesn't fit in this bore very good because it's a little bit rusty. I actually made the fit, not really a press fit, but it's pretty close. It's pretty snug. So it passes through this tab here and into that bore of that factory mounting location here. As you can see, this is actually, this distance here, or this step, is the same length as the bore here. But by passing through the 3/8 plate, the 3/8 tab there, I end up with missing that distance by 3/8. And the reason I did that was I put the same shoulder on this spacer here. So this spacer is centered in that bore using that shoulder. This spacer here actually passes all the way through the bore on this tab or this ear right here, just shy of missing it by about 25 thousandths. That way it wouldn't bottom out when I tighten the bolt. I wanted everything on here in this location here to crush together and tie everything together as one unit. Not have anything floating or relying on a press fit or bore fitment, nothing like that. That's mostly just to locate it. These ears here are 3/8 plate. These tabs, whatever you want to refer to them as, both top and bottom. And then these plates here are basically just a laminate plate. It will get welded around the full perimeter. So what I will do is I will weld this plate on first, weld it to the knuckle all the way around here. Then this plate will get aligned with it, and then it will get welded and welded to the knuckle as well. This bolt head here is recessed down into this area here. The reason I went around this bolt location with this laminate plate is to create room for the bolt between the bolt and the tie rod. This tie rod is a 2-inch piece of 2-inch DOM with a threaded insert just tacked in place. The tie rods that will go on the machine when it's all done are going to be 2.5-inch diameter, 70-75 solid aluminum. So they'll be slightly bigger. The tie rods, the finished product tie rod, will just clear this bolt head by about 1/8 of an inch. This clearance here is the main reason for those step nuts. You wouldn't have room for a full-size nut here in this location. That was the reason for this spacer here, is to just give me just that room for everything to clear and fit. This tab here is just to put the tie rod in double shear. It will get welded all the way around here. Same with the lower one. And when all of that is done and welded in place, then these areas here will get boxed in with gussets, tying all of it together as well. Now, as you can see, like this tab here, or this arm, crosses over this parting line. I may go ahead and weld that, just weld that thing all the way across. If I ever do need to split this knuckle, it'd only take a minute to zip through that with a cutoff wheel on a grinder. A guy could split that enough to get the two halves of the knuckle apart without any issue. Now here on the barrel end of the cylinder, these 3/8 plates actually fit the contour of the housing, much like the truss here does. Only it's on the backside, fits around the housing, and it will get welded all the way around, top and bottom. And the reason for that is basically this is just going to end up being like a front truss across the front of that housing. That way, if I, pull a rookie move, chop the throttle in the air, end up augering into the dirt, nose dive it, hopefully the housing won't get bent in that, in that kind of a hit. Everything from the flange out, I can unbolt and replace. Everything from the flange in to the center is a lot more work to fix it if it gets damaged. So the goal is to make that piece right there as indestructible as possible and just worry about replacing those parts if I need to. Also on these steering cylinders, the fittings are towards the inside. And the reasoning for that is I don't want to worry about, damaging hydraulic hoses when it gets slammed into cars or into dirt banks or, something happens to it. If I could keep the hydraulic hoses back behind the cylinders and protected, I would feel better about that. If you look closely, there are a couple of windows cut into these, and those are basically for the hose. The hose will pass through this window here. This window is access so that I can reach in there and tighten the fittings with an end wrench. I'm going to plumb, to start with, I'm going to plumb the steering just to the barrel ends of the cylinders. So this fitting on this cylinder here, on this end of the cylinder, is going to push this ram out. Same on this side. So you'll have a left turn ram and a right turn ram. The tie rods are tying the two together. If it turns out that I need more steering force, then I will go ahead and use the rod end as well, just to get more surface area for the hydraulic pressure to work against. I think that's pretty much covering everything that I'm, to the point that I'm at right now with this project. Really what I need to do next is basically disassemble this whole thing and start getting all of this stuff welded out. Cylinder mounts, all of the steering mounts on the knuckles, get that stuff all welded out. Then I can drag the front housing up on the table, get it set up, same thing. Get it all tacked up, make sure that my steering and all of those, the steering cylinder mounts, all of that stuff is gonna work with the knuckles rotated slightly compared to this axle. And then once I know that's good and tacked up, I can get everything welded out on the rear, on the front housing. The next step will be upper link mounts, shock mounts, anti-sway bar mounts on both housings. Then I will get into wheel tethers. But we won't even get into that till I get to that point. Right now, what I really need to do is get to work and get these things done. Okay, I got the rear housing completely disassembled and got the steering cylinder mounts all welded up, so that part is done. But before I started welding on the knuckles, I decided maybe I better put the front housing up on the table, get it all mocked up and to the same point that this rear housing is. That way, if there's any changes I need to make, or just make sure everything is gonna work on that housing. Well, early on in the project, I had actually taken the knuckles that came on the original 4 corners that I had acquired, and I thought I had a plan, and I ended up cutting the factory Pettibone steering cylinder mount off of 2 of these knuckles. Turns out my plan deviated, and now I need those parts. It's really unfortunate because these are a nice clean set of knuckles that no longer have the steering cylinder mounts that I want to use. I have a couple options there. I could probably draw up new tabs and have a set cut out on the water jet. I could weld them back in place. Maybe I could go out and dig through my scrap iron bin. I'm pretty sure that's where the original ones are at. I could look into welding these back on. Or maybe I can just find somebody else that is running Pettibone corners that could use these knuckles because they're not using the Pettibone steering cylinder location. I don't know, I'll figure it out. Maybe I can just trade for a set that haven't been chopped on yet. Fortunately, I had already disassembled another pair of corners here. So I have another couple of knuckles. But unfortunately, I started cleaning these up and I noticed that one of the knuckles that I have has thread repairs right here in 2 of the holes. They're just basic helicoil setup. And I'm sure that this knuckle is fine. I'm sure this repair will probably be fine, but that's really not how I want to start this whole operation. So I guess my only option right now is to go out and pull a couple of corners off of that log loader that Allison and I went to Montana and picked up last summer. So I think I'm gonna go out there, take a look at that, see if I can get that thing parked somewhere in the yard or kind of situated where I can use the crane to lift and crib up that log loader. And then we'll get, I think, the rear knuckles, the rear corner assemblies pulled off of that machine, drag them in the shop, get them disassembled, see if those knuckles off of that machine are in better shape and something that I can use for this project. Well, I'm pretty disappointed. It's about 95 degrees out here, and I think my camera overheated and shut off. So obviously we got the corners off of this machine. My wife showed up to help me with the groundwork, and Allison did an excellent job running the crane. I'm gonna have to get her some more seat time in that thing. She did a really good job. I'd like to see her do more of that. So obviously these studs, everything here, I had to wrestle with this side a little bit. This stud was kind of stuck in both this flange here and the champagne. So it was a bit of a wrestling match. I ended up using the nut against the frame here to jack that stud out. Once I got it out of there, this corner came right off. Then once everything was disassembled, I could knock the stud out of the champagne, not a big deal. The other side basically fell off. By the time I got done wrestling this corner off, the other side was parted away from the housing and just basically hanging on the axle. So it was easy to hook onto it with the crane, swing it on over out of the way. Now they're over here on the ground. I'm gonna grab the little loader, run them in the shop, start getting them all disassembled, run everything through the parts washer, and see what I have for parts. The beauty of editing video is it makes this whole process a lot faster for you guys. It's been about 2 weeks since I removed these corners from that log loader out there in the yard. In that time, I have been cycling these things through a tub of evaporust and doing a little wire wheel action just to get them cleaned up. Turns out they are in pretty good shape. There's a little bit of wear on those steering cylinder tabs, but I'll kind of cover what I got planned to fix that. Also, since removing those knuckles, last days off, I had the opportunity to go to Moses Lake, Washington and drive the USA 1 monster truck. That was a pretty cool experience, had a really good time. I was able to run the truck for 2 shows. I didn't tear it up too bad. The transmission failed in show 1, and Jared Compton and I were able to go through and take 2 transmissions, slap enough stuff together at intermission between the 2 shows, and got the truck back out there and run it a full show in the evening show without really any issues at all. I'll go ahead and plug a couple clips of that show, that evening show in here, just to liven this video up a little bit. Like I said, it was a really fun weekend, and I appreciate the opportunity to put my butt in somebody else's seat and, get a little bit more experience and a little more seat time in these trucks. Now we're going to turn this camera around and take a look at the steering on this unit. Now, if we look really closely, the wear I was talking about is just basically this face on this tab. And what that comes from is just the weight of half of that cylinder sitting there for decades, just turning back and forth and slowly wearing. Probably lack of grease of any kind, and any grease that is in this joint is probably infused with dirt and grit. And it just, over the years, it just takes its toll and wears it out. If a guy wanted to fix it right, you would probably weld this thing up, set it up in the mill and face it off. Probably the easiest way for me would be to lay it face down on this parting line, come in with an end mill and face it off that way. That'd probably get it in the ballpark. But since I have to build these spacers anyway, I'm just gonna take a measurement off of this original surface down to the wear surface here and just make this spacer, whatever that is, probably about 40 or 50 thousandths deep. I'll just make this spacer that much longer and compensate for it that way. Now, another thing to look at, as I've mentioned a half a dozen times already in this video, this is the front axle and it has caster built into it. So these knuckles and champagnes are rolled back, actually about 12 degrees in relation to this housing. So on the rear axle, if you were to look closely with the knuckles and the champagnes bolted on, these tabs for the steering cylinder are centered with the center line of the housing. This one here, being rolled back, is quite a bit different. And what I'm going to try to do is use these same tabs or these same gusset cylinder mounts on the housing and build different length spacers. Where the rear axle has got the same length spacers, they're about 1 inch and 1 inch with enough room for the cylinder in between. I'm going to do more like 1/4 of an inch. Then you'll have the cylinder, and then you'll have a long spacer on the top, and try and just space it down in the knuckle to where I can get that cylinder in here centered on the housing. If I can't make it all up with these bushings, I may put these brackets on the axle housing here just a touch wider and maybe be able to pull the cylinder up in the mounting area here. What I'll do now is go out to the lathe and start whittling on some 2-inch cold roll. See if I can get these spacers all done up. There they are. I got all 4 of these spacers built. You can see how they fit in this bore here. Same on the lower one, just steps down. Then you've got this threaded shouldered nut that fits in here. I can weld that area there, just like the rear axle. I've got this side over here, basically mocked up. It's all bolted in place. Got the plates here, just making sure everything fits like it's supposed to. Got a little miniature cribbing here just to make sure I'm not way out to lunch on this deal. Yeah, it looks to me like I'm going to be able to use the same brackets as what I've got on the rear axle. So I'm gonna run down to Dad's house, get this same exact setup cut out. I'll have to come back up here to the shop, get them cleaned up, drill those holes out. Normally on a bolt hole, I will cut them on the plasma cam one size down. So that's a 1-inch hole. I'll cut it to 3/4, then set it up in the mill and run a 1-inch end mill through there just to make sure I have a nice clean bolt hole. So that's where I'm headed next. can see, the front housing is now basically at the same stage as the rear housing, shy of welding these cylinder mounts on. That means both housings are ready for upper link mounts, shock mounts, anti-roll bar mounts, and driveline cage mounts. Basically, that's a whole bunch of little tabs and brackets that I have to get kind of drawn up, cut out, cleaned up, and welded back on here. Now, with that said, I'm not going to include that in this video. As a matter of fact, I'm going to wrap this video up here because it's just getting too long. I'm also probably going to just skip over those parts. I'll get them welded on, get that stuff all wrapped up. Then I'll bring you guys back in the next video where I'm going to tear into the third members. The rear differential third member is going to get a spool, and the front is going to get a Detroit no-spin style locker. So that'll be pretty interesting to tear those apart, kind of get a look at the guts and install those new pieces. While I'm at that, I still have to design and install a pinion brake kit. So all of that will go into the next video. With any luck, I will also be able to do the final assembly on this stuff, get them cleaned up, assembled, sealed up, get a little paint on them, and then I can start looking at getting these things actually installed in the truck, finally. So until then, as always, thanks for watching. Have a good one.
There we go.
Now which one? That one?
Yes.
Hold on just a second.
Okay. Oh, yeah.